Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Laura Kovacs, and I'm honored to be here this evening to introduce Frank Bruni. In a two-decade career at the New York Times, Frank Bruni has been the paper's Rome bureau chief, head restaurant critic, White House correspondent, and staff writer for its Sunday magazine, among other positions. His new book dismantles the myth that a student's future depends on the current flawed university admissions process and thoughtfully makes the case that where we go to college will have infinitely less bearing on our fulfillment in life than so much else. What a student gets from college has more to do with the attitude and energy brought to it and less to do with the school's prestige. College, in the end, is what you make of it. Qualities like resilience, perseverance, determination, and cleverness aren't the exclusive province of elite schools. Bruni's first two books, Ambling into History, The Unlikely Odyssey of George W. Bush, and Born Round, The Secret History of a Full-Time Eater, met with critical acclaim and wide popularity. Tonight, he'll be joined in conversation with Kristen Graham, a staff writer and education reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Frank Bruni and Kristen Graham to the Free Library.
Good evening. So let's kick it off. 'Tis the season, Frank. The Ivies have just sent out those fateful admission decision letters, and it looks like the acceptance rates are even lower than in previous years at many schools.
You noticed, yeah.
I did. Give us the big picture here. Talk a little bit about the college admissions mania and what prompted you to tackle the subject.
Well, when I was applying to school back in the 80s, I thought things were pretty frenzied and crazy. And what I've seen in recent years, not just in terms of these plunging acceptance rates, and the two forces are connected, but the desperation of kids to get into these schools, the strategies they deploy, the whole industrialized admission consultant process. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. I wrote this book because I was noticing and taking stock of all this anxiety, and then I would look around me at the successful people I know, the successful people that I, like you, have interviewed over the course of a long journalism career, and I didn't see as close a relationship between professional achievement and an Ivy League pedigree as the desperation to get into highly selective schools suggested there should be. And so I felt someone needed to talk about that and kind of put things back into a better balance.
So Stanford accepts a stunningly low 5% of students who apply for admission, which I read that about 3 times and checked it because that's
Yeah, I think it was 5.05 this year or something, or 5.02.
And they were probably proud that
down
it went down
from
a little bit.
5.07 the previous
right,
year.
Right.
They're going to get into negative integers by 5 years from now. This year we accepted negative 1%. We're going to have an empty freshman class.
Right, and we'll have it on the front pages of our newspapers. Right. So having an admissions rate in the single digits seems to be a badge of honor for some colleges. But in the book, you talk a little bit about how that's more than a little deceptive, how legacies matter and athletes matter, and how colleges knock themselves out to get more and more students to apply. Are colleges accepting fewer students? How are those admissions rates going down so much?
Well, they're going down in large part because students are applying to more schools than ever before. So if a Stanford, say, has 45,000 applications, that's partly because a broader universe of students are reaching for Stanford than ever before, but it's also because a student who 10 years ago would have applied to 10 schools is now applying to 20. And so
20.
I've run into many students at high schools who tell me that the norm at their high school is 15 or 18 applications.
Wow.
And this really bums me out because, this is just kind of a commonsensical thing. If you're applying to 18 schools, you're not putting that much thought into whether a school is really going to be the right one for you. You're just throwing darts at a board. But it's a vicious cycle because you throw more darts at the board when you see acceptance rates like this and you feel like you want to somehow improve your mathematical odds. And it's one of the reasons I think it's going to be really hard to get out of this.
Has the Common App fueled this, I imagine?
Yeah, because when I applied, and I didn't get very far, I didn't do that many applications for particular reasons. But I mean, I remember when I was filling out the application for one school, I remember doing it on paper on an electric typewriter. I mean, I remember an electric typewriter, you know, which,
Me too.
now it's not, there was a common app then, but very few schools used it. Apparently it's been around since 76, but no one really heard of it much until many years after. The combination of the common app and the computer,
Right.
and literally the cut and paste function of a computer, makes it no more time consuming for a kid to do 20 applications today than it was for maybe someone in my era to do 6 applications.
I was interviewing a student recently who said, oh, you know, I decided I was going to apply to, 10 schools, and I thought of an 11th, and I just, took my essays and did that, cut
Right.
and paste, college X and substitute college Y.
And what's really sad is schools are surrendering to this in ways that's very cynical. So the University of Chicago, many years ago, decades ago, used to have an acceptance rate that was not at all like Harvard's or Yale's. It was much, much higher because their application was decidedly rigorous. And they were okay with having, and I'm making up the number now, but they were okay with having a 45% acceptance rate because they were still getting students at the caliber of any other school.
Right.
They just weren't getting casual applicants because filling out a University of Chicago application was hard. They took pride in that. They felt like that was a way of sorting and making sure they got really serious students. They've since done a 180 because in today's climate, they can't go out into the world with a 20% acceptance rate and convince any of the consumers out there that they're really as elite a school as a school with a 7% acceptance rate. Swarthmore saw its applications go down a year or two ago. And they investigated why, and it was because their essay requirements were just a little bit more rigorous, the essays that you do supplemental to the Common App, than in other schools. Rather than saying, okay, we're cool with that because it means we're getting applicants who are really interested in Swarthmore, they caved, and they made the requirements more in line, more lenient, more in line with other schools because they didn't want their acceptance rate to suffer and they didn't want to look less selective.
Wow. Some of the anecdotes you describe in the book truly are stranger than fiction. I'm thinking in particular about the student who faked being gay and coming out to his family to impress a college with an essay. The kids who joked about a bus full of Model UN students crashing, so their own chances at being accepted to a resume-burnishing honor society were increased. And my personal favorite, the student who bragged to a Yale admissions officer that rather than excuse herself from a conversation with the teacher she admired, she decided she would urinate on herself. What on earth? What were some of the wildest, I just have to get into this school or else stories you found in reporting the book? And what do those stories say about us?
Well, they say, well, I'll tell you the other story that really haunted me, and this was told to me by an Ivy League professor whom I know well. And I don't want to name the school because I don't want to blow his cover or whatever, but he was talking about getting a visit from a couple of relatives. They weren't close relatives, but they knew him well enough to drop by his office. And they brought their daughter by, and she was going to be applying to the school. And it was clear the visit was about show off the daughter, maybe the professor is impressed, maybe he picks up the phone or bangs out an email and says to somebody in the admissions committee, wow, I just met the most fabulous young woman, we have to have her here. And so he said, they were giving him, they were talking about her grades, they were talking about her SATs, they were talking about her extracurriculars, and it was this panicked mode where they just kind of wanted to make sure everything they could say that might possibly impress him.
She was the show pony.
Had been said, yeah. And at the last minute, either the mother or father turns to the daughter and says, don't forget to tell him how you're president of your high school Survivors of Bulimia Society.
Oh my goodness.
Now, I mean, you go, ooh, or you laugh or whatever, but I think that's not a random story. That's a sign of a generation of kids and a generation of parents who feel like getting in is worth any effort, any humiliation, who feel like the need to stand out is so profound that maybe you should say you urinated on yourself during a conversation with a teacher because you're so intellectually serious, the bathroom matters less than big thoughts. Or maybe you should, bring your bulimia into the equation. A woman who used to be the dean of admissions at MIT for many years told me she read essays where kids talked about delicate cutting, where they talked about their father abusing their mother and the police having to be called. They were just so desperate to stand out and to paint an image of themselves as someone who'd overcome great hardship, because getting in was what mattered, not how you did it.
Eureka College, Whittier College, the University of Delaware. These are a few of the institutions of higher learning that have produced leaders such as Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and Joe Biden. President Obama, who graduated from Columbia, began his studies at Occidental College. You point out in the book that journalists, and I suppose I'm guilty of this myself,
Me too.
love to note when people studied at Harvard, but often gloss over the fact that many people in positions of power attended colleges that some might consider middle of the road. For those of us who have been conditioned to believe that only elite schools pave the path to success, what does this mean?
Well, that we do that means that we edit reality into a very selective narrative that then feeds the anxiety that parents and kids feel because they're getting a distorted picture of the world. So one of the ways that became crystal clear to me is we've all read a lot, for some of our tastes maybe too much, about Ted Cruz over the last year or two, right? When you read a profile of Ted Cruz, you hear pretty quickly that he went to Princeton and that he went to Harvard Law. And it's presented, or it's included there as if it's an explanation of the success. If you read a profile of Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal, you are likely to find very soon in that profile that he went to Brown and then was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. When you read a profile of Marco Rubio, you don't hear about state universities in Florida. When you read a profile of Chris Christie, you don't hear immediately about the University of Delaware followed by Seton Hall Law School, because that wouldn't seem to explain the
Doesn't fit
success.
the
So it's a
narrative.
really narrow thinking that I think turns what is an advantage in life, perhaps, an Ivy League education, into this mythology that's more powerful than it truly is in reality.
In the book, former Kenyon College Dean Jennifer Delahunty describes her own college experiences. She attended the University of Arizona, and she said that as she was choosing a school, her father discouraged her from even looking at the Ivy League because snooty girls went there. Today, Delahunty says her father would have said, "We absolutely must visit the Ivy League." How did things change? How did we get here?
Well, I mean, schools did a much better job of marketing themselves, and partly we got here for some reasons of some good intentions were involved. So when she tells that story, I mean, the bright side of that story is that there are children from regions of the country or from economic backgrounds who are looking at the most quote-unquote elite institutions, and they might not have looked at them 20 years ago, and that's really good. I mean, the applicant pool has been expanded in a way that to some degree is more meritocratic, and that's great. But also, the status of these schools has risen. And the other factor that I think is huge here and very sad, because it's a reflection of how we feel about ourselves as a country, over the last 10 years, in a marked change from before, if you ask Americans, is the country on the wrong track or the right track, a majority say wrong track. If you ask them, will your kids do better than you did, they no longer do we have clean majorities in this country of supposed optimism saying, yes, my kids will do better. There's a sort of sustained economic pessimism. And I think parents, for the most sympathetic, I mean, for the nicest reasons, are more worried than ever about the future their kids are going to have, are more concerned than ever about making sure their kids have any leg up, which again is a great impulse. And these elite schools are seen as a possible leg up. Right. And the hunger to get that leg up is more intense than ever before because of the pessimism and the concern about the future.
Let's talk about the dreaded U.S. News and World Report's rankings. One college official you interviewed for the book described them as implying a kind of scientific evaluation of quality, but really not doing that at all. How big a role do the rankings play in driving this mania, and are they kind of a chief villain here?
They play, I mean, they're one of many, many culprits. I don't think they're the main culprit, but they need to be looked at as one of the culprits. I think as college has gotten so much more expensive, I think people are more eager than before even to outsource their judgment and have some external authority tell them what to do. I mean, that's a human impulse. We surrender. We want someone else to tell us what to do, whether it's a god or whether it's a government or whatever. We want U.S. News to tell us where to send our kids to school. The problem is you can game those rankings. You can decide as a school that you want your ranking to be higher, and you can make efforts in that direction. The other problem is the metrics they use, some of the ways they measure a school's worth, are very debatable. I mean, one big chunk of the ranking is what university presidents, deans of admission, and provosts at other schools say about your school. But if you really talk to those people, they don't know the reality at more than their school or more than a few other schools. So they're checking the boxes based on the school's reputation. Well, the school's reputation is based on the U.S. News and World Report rankings.
It's a vicious cycle.
So it's a self-perpetuating reality.
So you alluded to this a bit before. How much does parental anxiety figure in? There are places in this country where people hire consultants to help them get their toddlers into the best preschool, figuring that surely this lays the foundation to the Ivy League and a successful life, of course. How much do parents factor into the mania? What are they so anxious about?
Oh, they factor in usually, and they're anxious, I think, about their kids' economic future. I think, and that's the nice part of it, and I think that's the biggest part of it. But I also think to some degree we live in a country that I think is getting ever more status conscious. And I think a lot of parents see where their kid gets into school as the final report card in their parenting. It's the ultimate validation or it's the ultimate humiliation. And I just think that's silly when you think about so many other factors. The thing about this admissions mania that drives me nuttiest is there's all these things we know, common sense things as people, that we just throw out the window in order to become obsessed about what happens on these few days in March. For instance, a lot of kids, a lot of people bloom late in life. There have been whole books written about the amazing things done by late bloomers. We throw that knowledge out the window when we decide that what happens in the senior year of high school is going to be this profound determinant of a whole rest of a life.
There's a perception that going to an elite college is a road to an elite job, that connections one makes at such universities help pave the path to high-powered careers. Do you discount those alumni networks? How do they fit into the calculus?
No, I don't discount them at all. And it's sometimes frustrating when I hear people say, oh, so you wrote the anti-Ivy League book. Not at all, no. What I quibble with is I think we portray the possible edge or advantage as being much more profound than it is in reality. We give the impression that the only sure road to success is through these elite institutions. And we also mischaracterize the durability of that advantage. Once you reach the age, you and I know this, I assume you're over 30, right? Yeah, okay. Most people in this audience look like they're over 30. I mean, once you're 30, 35, no one asks, future employers don't ask you where you went to school. People you're meeting who are making some sort of professional assessment of you don't ask you where you went to school. So I quibble with the notion that this is something, these 4 years at one of those most hallowed institutions, is something that is going to guarantee your success forevermore.
Which kind of leads me into my next question. Is this a caution against Ivy League institutions? You referenced the author of a book called Excellent Sheep, who taught at Yale and wrote about the disadvantages of an Ivy League education. Where do you fall on that? I know that you taught at Princeton, I think, last year.
I did this spring semester last year.
So talk a little bit about where you are on the Ivies.
I'm not as negative about them, or even really negative about them as he is. I have a couple of concerns. One is I don't think some of those schools are the right place. They're not the right place for every student. Sure. There's a young woman I interviewed in the book who went to Columbia, and she went to Columbia because she was supposed to lust after a school like that with a low acceptance rate. And then she got to Columbia, and again, following the herd, she became an economics major because that's the most popular major at Ivy League institutions.
Did she become a consultant?
And then she became a management consultant. And she got exactly the kind of plum job that she's supposed to get, was with Bain Consulting. And she looked up and she thought, this isn't who I am. I don't want this job. I don't know how I got on this track. She ultimately quit. She's now at a medical school in Oregon that probably no one's ever heard of. It doesn't make your knees go weak when its name is mentioned. And she's very happy. And she wonders about how many other people there are like her who were just trying to hit their marks, the marks of overachievement. Got to do this, got to do that, got to do that, and never pause to think about whether that path was right for them. I worry about that. The other thing I worry about in relation to the Ivy League is something a lot of professors at Princeton observed to me, which is a lot of the kids who get into these best schools, they've been so intent on access that they're shortchanging the experience on the far side of access. So they feel like these kids put their best selves into the service of getting in, and then once they got there, felt my work is done. I'm here. I'm going to have a Princeton diploma.
So along those lines, I am thinking about the anecdote in your book where you talk about, you taught this class, it was oversubscribed, and you went back and read the essays the kids, or the letters the kids wrote to try to get into the class. Tell us that story.
I taught a food writing class at Princeton a year ago this semester. We're in the spring semester, right? Yeah, I lose track of time. It was because it sounded fun, a food writing class, and maybe because some of the kids in there recognized my name from the Times. It was predictably oversubscribed. So there were 48 applicants for it's limited to 16. And in a situation like that, they have them all write something for the professor to be and let the professor to be decide. So I read all of the letters. I chose my 16 students, and about halfway through the semester, it occurred to me that many and probably most of the students in the class had never written anything in the class that showed the polish, the verve, the energy, the whatever that their letters had. And I even went back and looked at the letters to make sure that I wasn't, that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. And when I mentioned this fact to other faculty members, they, to a person, said, well, that doesn't surprise me at all. They've been trained to get into things. They saw your class listed. They thought, that's going to be a competition. And once they bested the competitors and got in, they felt like, well, that's the achievement. And these professors even took it a step further, and this is a way in which their comments dovetail with that book, Excellent Sheep. And they said that they think one of the reasons so many Princeton students aim for Wall Street, for the financial industries, is because that's the next competition, that's the next culling. That rhythm is what's familiar to them. Look at the prize that not everybody's going to get. Yeah.
So tell us about your own college selection process. How did your family background shape that decision? Your parents, you wrote, sent you and your siblings to a private high school to help maximize your chances of getting into a good school. How did your parents feel about your college decision?
Well, my parents were very college focused. My dad grew up poor and went to Dartmouth and felt that had a huge part, that was a huge factor in his success. And I want to come back to that in a moment because there's a funny postscript to that. They were very conscious of it. My mother would drive around our suburb and she would read the stickers on the back of cars.
Keep those stickers.
And yeah, so I mean,
Make me nervous.
The audio of my childhood was my mom like leaning forward in the car and going, Amherst, Duke, Princeton. Ooh, they did really well, My brother went to Amherst. My younger brother went to Dartmouth. My sister went to Princeton. So mom was in sticker heaven. And I ruined, I was the skunk in the garden party because I went to UNC Chapel Hill. I had applied early action to Yale, which had been my dream. I'd gotten in, and then I was offered a full merit scholarship to UNC Chapel Hill. And even though my family could afford Yale, I mean, not painlessly, because I don't think there's ever any painless when it comes to that amount of money, I just didn't see how it made sense to turn down a free education at a terrific state university just for the Yale name. And I also felt very strongly, because I was coming from a private school in the Northeast, that Yale would in many ways be an extrapolation of what I already knew. And that if college is supposed to be about broadening you and really kind of challenging your assumptions, going all the way to the South, where I'd spent no time, to a state university where 85% of the kids were going to be from North Carolina, that would be a kind of more disruptive, eye-opening, challenging thing. And so I did that.
Well, I knew there was a reason you and I got along, Frank. I have a similar story. Grew up kind of working class here in Philadelphia, had my sights set on Yale and got into Yale and saw the price tag. And I said, I think I'll take your full scholarship, Temple University.
Nice.
Fine.
So we should start some sort of group.
I think we should, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It's not like the Yale Refugees, but,
Right.
Something like that. Yeah. It starts tonight here.
We graduated with no student debt or little student debt, so that was nice.
Correct.
Yeah. So you write about John Green, who was a middling student in high school and who was crushed when he was turned away from an advanced fiction writing class at Kenyon College. He went on to write the phenomenally successful bestseller, The Fault in Our Stars. Talked a little bit about this earlier, but let's talk about late bloomers and how unrealistic it is for us to expect that 17-year-olds are at the peak of their performance and able to determine the path of the rest of their lives.
No, he's in the book for exactly that reason. When I mention late bloomers, he's the person I most have in mind, because it's not only did he get rejected for the intermediate after introductory writing course, which for many a kid or young man or young woman would have been like, okay, now I shouldn't write anymore. But when he was telling me that in high school he had like a 2.9 GPA, didn't do that well on the SATs, and told me, interestingly, he did better on the math than the verbal SATs.
Oh, wow.
Again, so I mean, these things are only so predictive. And if he had let those early measuring sticks be binding ones, he wouldn't be where he is today.
That's great. So how do you effectively lessen the pressure? Should students limit the number of schools they apply to? How do you fix this admissions mania?
I don't think it's going to be fixed easily, and I think there are a whole lot of things that need to be done, and sadly some of the things that one might suggest are not really doable, like limiting application numbers, whatever. But I think where it really has to start is in the conversations we have with kids and the conversations parents have with their kids. I think in ways we don't necessarily intend. We often send the message that where they go to college, that where they get into college is going to be like the ultimate reflection and the binding verdict on who they are. And I find myself, for example, when I talk to my nieces and nephews, I've stopped using the obvious conversation opener, what are you thinking about college? Because I realize that when you do that all the time, even though you're just maybe looking for a point of connection and just trying to find a conversational route into them, you're sending the message that this is the largest thing in life.
That's fraud.
Now, when a charter school in Harlem talks about college every day, which the Success Academies, which is a big success story in New York, when they talk to kids every day about college, that makes sense because they're trying to inject college into the vocabulary of kids who don't necessarily see that in their future. When you're living in an affluent suburb in the Northeast and you're constantly talking about college, and did you hear that Sammy next door got into Harvard, it's not doing the same thing. It's injecting anxiety into a process that needs less of it.
So what would you say to a student who, in this season of thick and thin envelopes and gut-wrenching waiting, does not get the news they want, who gets rejected from all of their top schools?
Well, I mean, I'd say you need to read Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be.
Available
on
bookstores
Amazon. No, I'm just kidding.
And the hobby.
No, I mean, I would say, you know, there are so many, just countless examples in life of people who didn't even think they could apply to the schools that rejected you, of people who couldn't aspire to go to those schools for economic or other reasons. There are countless examples of people who were rejected by schools that were even less selective than the ones that rejected you. This is one moment, one juncture in a very long life, and it's not going to define you unless you let it define you.
To follow up on that, talk about how a rejection from a top school can be a blessing. Give us an example. I'm thinking about the story you tell in the book about the student who wanted to go to Dartmouth or Middlebury but ended up at William and Mary.
There are a number of kids in the book, and again, this is one of those things that tracks with common sense, but we throw common sense out the window. There are a number of kids in the book who did not get into the schools they wanted to. Schools that would have been overcrowded with overachievers, went to schools where the temperature was maybe a little lower, and suddenly found themselves being noticed by teachers in a way they never had before. Suddenly found themselves with a degree of confidence that they never had before. The one you're referring to who wanted desperately to go to Tufts, didn't get in, went to William and Mary. He's now a graduate student, he's now a doctoral student at MIT, you know? There's another gentleman in the book who aspired not to go to Harvard or Yale, but to go to the University of Michigan or University of Illinois, was rejected by both, went to Indiana University. He's finishing up business school at Harvard now, you know? Life is long. Life is long.
Lots of different paths to get to where you want to go. Were you surprised by how many people inside the system, college presidents, for instance, kind of hate it and feel like they're trapped?
A little bit, yeah. But I think they all are kind of lashed to the mast of something that they don't know how to get out of. I think some of them are being a little bit disingenuous. Now, they all will tell you that they would like to see the U.S. News rankings go away, and yet they all continue to participate in it,
Right.
provide U.S. News all the information it asks for. There needs to be a sort of mutual disarmament, you know, that is not happening.
Let's talk, I think our time is up for this part, but one more question. Let's
Sure.
talk about equity. This college admissions mania is often the purview of the upper middle class and beyond, it seems. For the people going through it, it can be excruciating, but in many ways, this is a problem only the privileged have, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, to some extent, yes. I think it's really important to remember, and one of the things that gets lost in this is what a blessing it is to be able to go to college, or to be able, even more than that, to weigh different colleges in the equation. I mean, there are people who can only consider one college, the one that's a couple blocks away or mass transit away, because they don't have the money. But this does filter down. I think it is mostly a problem of privilege, but it filters all the way down because it creates this sense of castes. You know, I write in the book about how we've become a country really good at creating these microclimates of privilege, microclimates of elitism, and I think that filters all the way down to kids who aren't necessarily going to these schools, but are looking at their school's exclusiveness, their school's degree of selectiveness, as some sort of reflection on where they belong in a country that I think is getting much, much too hierarchical.
I said that was the last question, but I lied. There's one more. So before you wrote this book and before you started taking on this topic, did anyone ever ask you, after you were maybe a few years out of college, where you went to college as Is it something
No,
that
I
came
mean,
up?
you know, when I was thinking back to when I interviewed at the New York Times, and I was still relatively young then. I think I was 30 when I went to the Times. I don't remember anybody talking to me about where I went to college or talking to me about the fact that I went to grad school at Columbia. All I remember them talking about were the stories from my newspapers before the Times that were lying in front of them. They didn't care.
Great. Well, I think we'll turn it over to the audience now. Go to questions. I'm sure you have questions for Frank.
Who picks?
I don't know.
I think the people wandering with the microphone pick.
Okay.
Or that's at least my way of wriggling off the hook.
There's someone in the back who's ready with a question.
An article about 8 years ago saying that students who got accepted to elite schools but then went to other schools did just as well as students who ended up going to the elite schools.
Yep.
Now, you two are great examples of people who were accepted and have the bragging rights,
Right.
but did the common sense thing of going to a full ride school. Are you the ultimate winners, you two?
Are we what?
The ultimate winners.
Well, I want to mention this. The story you read, or it was probably less than 8 years ago, but you're referring to a study that was done in 2 segments. It was updated last in 2011 by a Princeton economist named Alan Kruger and a colleague of his named Stacey Dale. And they did something. This is just a really, really fascinating study. They looked at the graduates of elite schools. I forget how they defined elite, and the graduates of less elite schools to see if they could see a differential in lifetime earnings. And when they initially did it, they found a 7% lifetime earnings advantage among the graduates of elite schools. But then they did this really, really clever thing, and they thought, well, what if we just look at a subset of the kids, of the people who did not go to elite schools, but applied to those schools and were perhaps rejected or for whatever reason didn't go to them. And they found if they looked at that subset against the graduates of elite schools, the earnings differential entirely disappeared. And what that showed was that if you were someone, regardless of where you went to school, who had a certain kind of reach in your identity, who saw yourself as someone who might entertain the possibility of that kind of altitude, that was more dispositive than whether you actually were educated at UPenn versus Penn State. Yeah, it was a fascinating study.
I think we've got some folks up here.
Yes, excuse me, given the fact that in many European nations you can go start medical school at age 18, would you comment on Kevin Carey's new book, The End of College?
I haven't had a chance to read more than a bit of Kevin's book and some of the coverage of it. So I'm not sure what aspect of his book you want me to comment on. I mean, I believe he talks a lot about online education. And I believe he raises the question of whether college is worth it, right? I'll just say I have a problem with the question and the conversation about whether college is worth it because it's always asked in a way that frames college as a solely vocational pursuit. And I think that if you can swing college, if it's affordable, if it's doable, I think it's about so much more than just skill acquisition and job preparation, especially today because I think we see the job market, the economy changing so rapidly and unpredictably that I don't think you can know with any certainty. Not only can you know with any certainty at 17 or 18 what you want to do for the rest of your life, I don't think you can make truly safe predictions about what the job market's going to want 10 or 20 years down the road. So I think the best way to use college, if you can, is as a place to make you more fluent in diversity, to make you a more nimble learner, to make you to give you a more flexible intellect, not to pick up X, Y, and Z skill. And all these discussions about is college worth it are doing a cost-benefit analysis based on jobs alone.
Hello. Over the years, I've seen my community college students achieve really terrific things. I think over half the college students in this country attend community colleges. And I wondered if you interviewed anybody who started out at community college or if you could just comment on that.
It's a great question. Interestingly, I wasn't looking or not looking for that. I don't think anybody in my book did go the community college route. And I should fix that for the paperback, so thank you. But no, I mean, just as a weird matter of happenstance. But I think the community college, it's good to bring that up because one of the things I think I saw again and again in the people I interviewed in the book, and one of the things that's become even clearer to me as I've gone out and talked about the book, is different rhythms and different paths make sense for different people. I wish more young men and women would take a year or two or even 3 before they go to college, because I think one of the real shames is very few of us, myself included, are mature enough at 17 or 18 to really appreciate what that college opportunity represents and to make the most of it, to till that landscape for everything it's worth. And I think for some kids, a span of time in community college, you know, as they figure certain things out or as they make a kind of transition, makes enormous sense. I think we talk with too limited a vocabulary about what the right path is when there are a lot of different paths that work better or worse for different people. I
also feel like the community college is something that comes into play a lot when we talk about college affordability.
Yeah.
Because for a lot of students, it's a smart way to go to get an associate's degree and then transfer to a school and come out with less debt.
Hi, Frank.
Hi.
One of your favorite Facebook fans. I have a question. I recently read an article that for white folks, it really doesn't matter where they go to college, but for minorities, it kind of gives an edge if they are going to an elite or public Ivy. Can you speak to that?
Well, interestingly, we can go back to the 2011 Alan Kruger, Stacey Dale study I was talking about. When they did that difference, when they kind of made that clever adjustment and found out that the 7% disappeared, you know, among the subset who'd reached, at least, or thought that that kind of school was within their reach, the exception was minority students. The differential did not disappear. And the conclusion they reached, which is basically reflected in your question, was that if you come from a certain kind of background, a background of a little bit more privilege, you have many ways of finding networks apart from college. Maybe they're residual from high school, maybe they're later on. And if you come from a community in which there aren't many people in the sorts of professions that you're aspiring to, who've been to college, those 4 years at a place with perhaps a more lustrous name and a more ready-made network actually do make a difference.
This question is a little bit predating the college application process. My son was accepted into an elite high school that you had to test into, and all of the classmates were really smart, and we're all in AP classes and all of that. And it was very disheartening to me to learn that the school had a very active cheating culture. And when one of the students asked my son if the student wanted to beam the chemistry answers to my son, he said no, and there was a very interesting lunch conversation afterwards where my son said he didn't cheat, and the student said, well, you're really naive. All of us cheat because we all want to get into Harvard and Yale, and they didn't have to cheat because they had the intellectual capacity to not cheat. And I'm wondering, in all of the interviews that you did, if anybody spoke candidly to you about the ways that they were able to get the grades and get into some of these elite schools that they wanted to get into.
I did not have anybody tell me they cheated. I don't think that's the kind of thing you tell a journalist who's writing things down for posterity. I mean, it's interesting you bring that up. We've very recently had a cheating scandal at Stanford. A couple of years ago, we had that big cheating scandal at Harvard. I think that it stands to reason or makes sense that when you make the stakes of having a fancy diploma seem as disproportionately high as we've made them seem, you are going to end up encouraging panicked, anxious, desperate kids to do things that they might not otherwise do. And I think we need to think long and hard about that. There are a number of ways in which I think this admissions mania is teaching a set of values that are not particularly good. One of those values, as I talked about earlier, is that getting in is what matters and not what you do when you're there. I think we need to ask what we're saying to kids when you hire at great price extremely expensive experts to massage and package them. I mean, as I was interviewing some of these experts and listening to parents talk about what they'd done, I had like the image of Sandra Bullock in Miss Congeniality being worked over, or a car making a pit stop at the Indy 500, and all the people come out. Are you saying to kids that money solves everything? That if you have to purchase an advantage, it's still worth it? Are you saying that they can't do these things on their own? That without a certain level of packaging, they're nothing? I think we need to ask hard questions about what sorts of behaviors we might be encouraging and what sorts of values we might be teaching by this exaggerated attention to getting into a certain kind of school.
So thank you so much for your talk. I have a question that touches more on learning as a whole. I find that society today is so focused with, jobs and earnings and salaries as markers of ultimate success, right? How much you earn determines whether you're successful or unsuccessful. And I wonder if we have lost the ability to value learning and education as a whole, which is what college was supposed to be, right? You went, you explored, you thought, you took classes that you weren't necessarily comfortable with, and you might have not done as well, but you still took them, right? You went to study abroad.
Yeah, you did not do a course because it was
Right.
dragged down your GPA.
Right.
Yeah.
And now I find that we have students who only get into these boxes and they stay in these boxes. And ultimately, because that's what they need to do, right? I do well in engineering, I'm gonna stay with that. I'm not gonna take an art class or something else because, God forbid, that'll knock down my GPA. And I wonder if that is actually creating a society that is very, well, goal-oriented, obviously, but not multifaceted, right? We're not, to me, very interesting as human beings anymore because we are in these little boxes that we put ourselves into.
Well, I think that's a valid concern. I would go a step further when you talk about boxes. And I mention this because it's something I think we should use universities and colleges to address. But it's not just that they're trying to check those boxes and money and all that, but we live in a world that increasingly allows you, because of the number of TV channels, the number of places, the number of websites you can go to, that lets people curate a universe, an existence that's entirely to their liking. So one of the reasons we have such bad political polarization is because people can just bookmark certain social media, certain websites, just follow certain social. You can create a universe in which you are just marinating constantly in this tiny, tiny ingredient, or just hearing only what you already believe echoed back at you. One of the real lost opportunities, I think, for universities right now is to kind of launch a preemptive strike against that and to insist that students mingle and mix in a way that maybe is not going to last beyond it, but that at least is a sort of, is an attempt beforehand, maybe a prophylactic against this tendency in American life, which I think is a big problem. I have this fantasy of a college initiation period where they make every student open their laptop and delete 10 of the Twitter accounts they follow, and follow 10 of the antonyms of that, and do the same, with their websites. And I think when kids are choosing school, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book, I think they should think about that. I think they should think about the fact that certain schools have have only token or zero socioeconomic or ideological diversity, and other schools have much greater diversity. And you may end up living in a very homogenous community later on in life. But by God, before that happens, expose yourself to a wider array of viewpoints and people.
Hi, I guess my question is about demographics. When I applied to a very good school, it was a natter of applications that year. And after that, they engaged in a national and international marketing campaign to get applications up. They had a lot of dorm and classroom space, but not a lot of warm bodies.
Right.
And I'm kind of wondering, I've heard stories about some of the smaller colleges not being able to compete and closing down. What's the future look like? Because apparently there's just as many young people now because of population growth and immigration as there was at the peak of the baby boom. And I'm kind of curious, what do the demographics look like? Are we just going to get more and more elite schools having lower and lower admission rates, other schools going out of business and folks being out of luck? or is there going to be growth in
Well,
the area of colleges?
I don't know the answer to your question, but some of the schools going out of business, it's not solely a matter of there not being enough bodies. So my guess is Sweetbriar is on your mind when you ask that question, and I believe, and I haven't followed that story super closely, but I believe I read something just recently saying that they actually were not suffering for applications. It was more a budgetary matter, which brings us to another extremely big problem, which is that schools today, in order to compete in this marketplace for students, are styling themselves into something akin to country clubs. And they feel the need to offer things that they felt no need to offer back when we were going to school. That all takes a lot of money. And so that crisis is, the crisis for a lot of schools is having enough money to compete as a service provider, as a place that has dining options, that has counselors, rock climbing wall, all that stuff, right? That's the real challenge for some of them, because we've let the expectations for what a college should provide a student change in some pretty wacky ways.
Thank you. In this era of college coaches and hyper competition, what advice would you give to high school students?
My advice would be to work really hard and get great grades, because that feels good and it's a maximization of your potential. My advice would be to do a lot of those things that we're telling kids to do now, but to take out of the vocabulary and the conversation so that Harvard will smile upon you, right? Because the truth is, Harvard's probably not going to smile upon you as a sheer matter of odds. So it's a silly thing to tether one's efforts to. But I also wish the thing if you're going to be successful and happy in life, it's because you're spending your time doing something that you're genuinely enthused about, that you're passionate about. So that should start in the high school years. If what you're really passionate about, if you are dedicating yourself to something, do not worry about how that is going to inform your college application. Because if you're the kind of person who in a dedicated, disciplined, and excellence-oriented fashion follows your passion, I guarantee you, you're going to do fine. I mean, unless the whole country tanks, and that's another conversation, right? But you're going to do fine relative to how the country is doing, and that's the thing that's going to go the distance, not whatever artificial dance you choreograph just for this one juncture in time when you're trying to impress this one jury of people, which is the College Admissions Committee.
Yes, I applied to college back in 1960, and at that time I went to Cheltenham High School, and it was an affluent suburb and still a very good school. But I do remember the pressure that I and my classmates were under, that it wasn't enough to just be an A and B student. You had to be a well-rounded teenager, so that you were part of the debating team. You ran the canned good drives at Thanksgiving time. You were in the stage play. You did this and that. So that not only were you an A and B student, but you were a healthy, socialized teenager. It sounds as like what you just said is it, let me put it this way, is it still a question of that Harvard really won't care? Or do admissions, this is the question, do admissions committees really care about all the extracurricular stuff, or are they really looking at, if you didn't do anything?
I'm going to answer that to the best of my knowledge, but I kind of hate answering it because I don't want this to turn into how do I impress the admissions committee. And I know you're not asking it in that vein, but it kind of bleeds into that area. It is my understanding that what admissions committees care about today is that you sort of have the bases covered and then have one thing that nobody else has. Because they're essentially casting the university. They're casting the freshman class. So at Princeton, for example, as I got to know my students, I could figure out often how each one got in. On top of being fabulous, on top of being generically fabulous, to coin an oxymoron, that's not enough. They had to, so one of the young women told me that she was recruited because she happened at school in Exeter to row. And there aren't that many young women who row, and Princeton has a female crew team. And so her stock suddenly shot up. Another young woman was a fencer, and Princeton has a fencing team, and most high schools don't graduate a whole lot of fencers, you know. So that's an added element, and I would just say, as a humorous aside, what you're describing about you want it to be well-rounded and show them that you punched all these holes, it's that today too, but it's on steroids, so you have to do all the things you talked about, but you also have to start a nonprofit for the underprivileged in the city nearest your home, even if you've only got 2 clients, yeah.
Hi, I have a 9th grader, and this year I have really noticed in school, wow, have we not been keeping up? Have you not been doing everything you were supposed to be doing from grade 1st to 8?
You mean you didn't start SAT prep at the 3rd grade?
I didn't do any travel, anything.
You should just call it quits then.
I know, we did a lot of fun family stuff together, not in school, and it kind of feels like as a parent now, that already we're thinking about college and how it's going to be and what are you doing. And I want my kid to be happy and have fun while she's doing it. Sure, I want her to do well. But does it always have to be constantly about that?
Well, not in your home it doesn't have to be because you control the dialogue there.
But it feels like the anxiety comes on because then you feel like, what are the colleges looking at? What is it you're supposed to be doing special? Wow, your extra other curricular, it's 20 hours a week. Oh, that's not enough. Now you have to do something else. It's kind of crazy for parents and the kids too, and you see that all around them.
Absolutely right.
And I do admission, but are colleges and admissions, do they know that, or it's kind of like they're playing to it as well?
They know it, but when you sit in their seats, you know, they have a student body to fill, and when they're deluged with all these perfect applications, they're going to do what anyone would do, and they're going to try to figure out how to cull from that perfection, and they're not going to worry about whether there's an excess of perfection. They're just going to keep on doing their jobs, keep on going along. And, you know, they're all locked into this thing where their acceptance rates are their bragging rights, and so when we ran, and I wish we had not run it on the front page, but when we ran a front page story last year in the New York Times, and maybe the Inquirer did the same about Stanford, setting a new record in exclusivity by falling to whatever it was, 5.07, which has now fallen to 5.02 as of a couple days ago. I guarantee you Harvard saw that and thought, we got to get snapping, you know? We got to get, and Harvard hit a new low for itself this year, you know? It's just madness.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering, with all of the economic anxiety that people are feeling now and the kind of demise of industrial jobs, well-paying blue-collar jobs, there seem to be fewer and fewer avenues to adulthood that don't involve college, or avenues to a secure adulthood. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that or write a book about it or something.
Oh, sure, I'll just do that tomorrow.
Spare time.
Just what else? What else?
You know, it depends on who you talk to. I mean, and a lot's been written about this, and I just graze it in the book. But if you go out to the Silicon Valley, if you go out to, you know, the tech startup world, you will find a lot of people who did not graduate from college. I interviewed the president of a very influential Silicon Valley sort of venture capital firm called Y Combinator. He's a Stanford dropout. Many of the projects they've funded are projects that were started by people who never finished college. It could be, you know, we're just seeing it right now, but it could be that one of the facets of the internet and of digital life is that it's created a platform for people to strut their stuff in a way that college may become much less important. If you are a fantastic writer, you don't have some of the avenues that we had available to us to kind of find an audience, but you can actually theoretically, and it happens, within a matter of months end up having huge success because this thing called the internet is a public square to which everyone has access. So I think there's still a lot of stuff shaking out, and there's still we may see a growth in the number of ways you can create a career and wealth without college, if you kind of extrapolate from what we're seeing in that regard.
And just a quick follow-up, do you think those avenues will be available only to people who are especially gifted?
Well, there are a lot of avenues in life that are only available to people who are especially gifted. I mean, one of the brutal truths of life is people who have enormous gifts often end up with, you know, enormous opportunities and possessions. Are we doing a good enough job of creating an economy in which people aren't as showily gifted as that can find a footing? No, we're not. We know that, you know, and supposedly we have fine minds in Washington working on that. Although, as I say that, I feel no less reassured than you do.
I guess I'll sit down. So my kids went through this process, I guess, my daughter's a junior in college and my son graduated 2 years ago.
But you survived.
We did.
Congratulations.
And we did it right, I have to say. I stayed under the radar. I didn't talk about college all the time. And we just started by visiting schools. Where do you think you fit in? Da-da-da-da. And both of them have done well, and they picked good schools, and they're fine. And the reason that I was very determined to do this is because when I went to school, and when you went to school, and we went to the same school, by the way, and we're in a class together. Way back
we were in a class together.
We were at UNC.
Which class?
Beverly Taylor's English 22 class.
Did I take that?
You did. You sat in the back. You had long hair, and you were right behind.
I never had long hair.
You did. It was kind of longish, and you were very thin then.
I don't think that was me.
Jeb Saunders was in our class.
I remember Jeb Saunders.
Yes. Yes. Anyway, she was a short little woman with long brown hair and a ponytail. It was like English from, oh gosh, Poe to, Eliot was the end. T.S. Eliot was the end. It was like an intro to English lit.
It might have been Chaucer to Eliot or something like that.
Something like that. Something like that. Anyway, long story short, my question, I was kind of obsessed with...
Anyway, nice to see you again. Yeah.
Okay, so I was kind of obsessed with
No, I should tell you, I was a little doubtful because I met someone at some appearance I did a year ago who thought that we had roomed together in college.
No.
And I'm not kidding you, and had been telling people that we were roommates. And I had to disprove the notion because I did remember all of my roommates through college. Right. And by the end of it, he was very crestfallen. But it was one of those moments where, you know, then you read those stories about how unreliable witness testimony is and memory is in court. It's one of those moments where I thought, well, there's, you know, wow, we were roommates. So, but I trust you. We were in the same class.
Yes, we were in this class. But anyway, and the reason why I put a lot of effort into this and interviewed lots of people, like, why did you pick your college and how did it work for you, was because I kind of wasn't, you know, I went to that state school because I could afford it, and I got in a couple of other places. So my question is, what made you kind of want to write this book, and did you feel like going to UNC was kind of a good move for you in general in life, and did it make you become the way you are, or was there something?
I'll take them in reverse order. I think going to UNC was a good move, but I say that knowing full well that as human beings, you are predisposed to believe you followed the right path, because to believe the opposite is just really depressing, right? So, you know, I might have really made something of myself if I'd gone to Yale, and I'll never know. I'll tell you one way in which I think it was indisputably a good path. I remember being very, very impressed when I was in college with the fact that my brother's friends from Amherst and Dartmouth, my sister's friends from Princeton, were all as wealthy or wealthier than my family was. And those schools talk about their diversity, and they've gotten a little better, but the truth of the matter is, if you look at the economic profile of those student bodies, it is a high altitude. My best friends at UNC, most of them worked part-time jobs to help with spending money because their parents could afford tuition but not everything else. Sometimes they worked part-time jobs to help pay tuition. I felt like I got an introduction, coming from a fairly affluent suburban background, an introduction to the real world, or to a little bit more of the real world. Chapel Hill wasn't really the real world. than they got, and I don't know what effect that had on me, but I have to believe that was a valuable thing. Why did I write the book? Because I couldn't believe, because the amount of anxiety, the amount of craziness that I was seeing, for me just didn't jibe with the reality of life and adulthood, which is that the successful people that I knew and that I'd gotten to know had a patchwork of educational backgrounds, not only one kind. And so I felt like there was this discrepancy between this myth that was developing and was feeding this anxiety and the way life really works out, and I felt it was worthy of exploring that.
That's a fine note to end it on. I think our time is up. Thank you all for your questions, and
Thank you
Frank,
very much
for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you.